Guys, happy to be here. Dimitri, as you said, I think that DePIN is kind of necessary to the large scale story of crypto. So I love that we have more of these DePIN events. So again, thanks to Dimitri and Ash for having us all here today. I think I'm excited to walk you through this because usually I give these presentations and I kind of do like a high level pitch about why what we're doing makes sense and the traction that we've built. And there's no traction in the slide, oddly enough, or any in this presentation. I want to give you guys, I guess, a little bit of a theoretical high level overview about what DePIN is, why I think it's interesting, and kind of the role that it plays in history. So this is a little bit of like the primer that I use when I'm kind of out there evaluating other DePIN projects and people say, hey, what do you think about this? What do you think about that? So hopefully at least this framework is a little bit of helpful. And if you guys have any questions, just feel free to stop me at any point. We can kind of go right into it. So the biggest kind of framework that I have is, I come from like a telecom background, right? We build, Dawn is a protocol for providing decentralized broadband, but we come from, a Web 2 world called Andrena, where we just build a lot of wireless infrastructure across 10 different states in the US right now. And from my perspective, my exposure, at least from the infrastructure side, has historically been kind of what PE calls digital infrastructure. And so there's obviously a little bit of stuff around the edges here where you're talking about like data for AI, cars, all of that kind of stuff. But by and large, this is kind of my framework, as I think that DePIN is essentially digital infrastructure that leverages some level of a technological breakthrough to really be able to bring a lower barrier to entry of this to be able to participate in this concept of digital infrastructure. And it doesn't matter whether it's like, a cool new way to distribute it to people. In our case, it's wireless technology combined with a lot of other stuff, but it can really be anything. And I think it's these two things together and that lowering of that barrier to entry, which is, again, just the most important part of all of this. And the role of where kind of all of these protocols come in start to emerge really when you look at the trade-offs that you can find across this entire model, right? In a world where these technology breakthroughs allow people to participate in digital infrastructure, right? Think towers, servers, GPUs, data centers, all that kind of stuff. You're in a scenario where now every single person can actually participate to a greater marketplace of digital infrastructure. And it's great because you can imagine a world where instead of big data center farms, you can have a bunch of people that have little GPUs that are doing federated learning, and now that's kind of the world that we're building in, right? Stuff is going more and more towards the edge. But when you have that, lower barrier to entry and manifests as a reduction in the stepwise capital investment needed to participate, the biggest thing is that just trust becomes an issue, right? Is that instead of dealing with these big companies that you have to rely on and you kind of have their reputation risk on the line, it's like you and your neighbor, right? And like I have neighbors and like that's not my idea of like how I want to do infrastructure and trust. But the role of all of these protocols like, us, Grass, Demo, Helium, we're all kind of just figuring out a way to be able to remove trust from this equation. And I think when you look at kind of the role that DePIN fits here, right, our job is really just to codify these rules on a blockchain that allow people to be able to interact together without trusting each other. And of course, there's a whole bunch of interesting things from like incentives and verification of the services. These are all different kind of, at least the way I think about it, modules that really allow people to participate in this greater digital infrastructure ecosystem. So it doesn't matter whether it's like a fleet of cars and all the telemetry that comes to that, whether it's AI inference, mobile hotspots, or broadband, we're all kind of doing the same thing one way or another. And you can kind of see, and the hope that I have to show you guys in a second, you can see like the real value of doing something like this. And I think like the past 3 slides have obviously been very abstract, but the point that I encourage you guys to think about is when you think about this definition and this abstraction, you can actually look back in history to see what is the value of this sort of stuff. And so like the whole point again of this whole preamble is I want you guys to be able to look back in history and say, where have we seen this paradigm take place and what does it lead to? Can we actually predict where the future is going based on this sort of mental model? And in the case of Dawn, which we'll get to in a second, I think we can. So the example that I always explain to people, if you're curious enough about internet infrastructure and all of that kind of stuff, is you look back into essentially the 70s, right? How did we go about to create the internet that we have it today? And it really goes from this simple mental model of like, we just need to have dedicated wires where you have people that are patching people together on a Bell switchboard, essentially, to a protocol for building to using shared wires. And the nature of that is it made it easy for data centers, cloud companies, internet service providers to really be able to start sharing wires to be able to lower the barrier to entry for everybody else, right? It's crazy to think about this kind of last point here is how many trillions of dollars were created because we asked ourselves the question, how do you go from using dedicated wires to allowing people to share wires? And this is really the nature of this kind of what the power of a protocol can be, right? You take this technology breakthrough and you apply this to some older infrastructure that allows you to scale it in ways that we didn't even think that were possible. And so, as I kind of hinted at before, when we look at sort of like the past and bring this into the future, I think that we are going through a similar type of a breakthrough right now, where we're going from a world where we have dedicated wires and TCP/IP brought us to a world of shared wires. And of course, you have technologies like routers and switches from Juniper and Cisco and all that kind of stuff that allow us to be able to use those shared wires. But similarly, the breakthrough that we're going through now, 50 years later, is we're going from a world where everything is built on wires to now things are built on wireless. And the interesting part about this is that there is no protocol that allows us to be able to do this at scale, right? You have technologies like Wi-Fi and 5G, but those are all kind of localized protocols. If you want to be able to take this wireless and bring it to an international scale, the same way that TCP/IP did, that's really the hole that we're filling. So, and I think the interesting part about all of this too is it all comes back to like the problem, right? What is the problem that each individual DePIN protocol is dealing with? And this one is, one of my favorite. If you ever heard me pitch, I always use this one, but this is the truth of that, right? That's my home internet bill from Verizon. I'm paying $128 for internet, but at the same time, that shit only costs me 50 cents at a data center, right? And that's like the experience that I have at Andrena is like we go to data centers, we buy at that rate, and we use that arbitrage to take advantage and to compete against these big guys. So on one side, like the arb is just insane, but on the second side, I'm only using 0.5% of my total supply whenever I'm doing a Zoom call. So I'm in a scenario where I'm overpaying compared to what's at wholesale, and I'm never using enough of what I actually have. And so in my mind, I look at these two things and I'm like, okay, something's got to change in the way that we go about this mental model. And that is really where I ask myself at least, like, why has this been the case and really what's the way forward? And I think the nature of it always comes down to, at least in digital infrastructure, is the CapEx. The CapEx is what tells you the story about why things are the way that they are. And again, these two metrics here is typically in TMT, they call it the cost to pass a home. What is the cost required to provide service to people? And if you're in a scenario where you have to spend close to $1,000+ per home just to be able to cover them, that I think is where things get very crazy and you need to have these massive arbs to be able to recoup your capital investment. But if you're in a scenario where for $10 to $15 you can provide coverage to a home, that's when things completely get to change. And so, I mean, it's a little bit of a sidestep here, but if you look at the most successful wireless models in history, that's why mobile, 5G, and stuff like Starlink is so powerful, is because the cost to cover is so low and it gets put on the back end in terms of the cost to activate, but in that scenario you have guaranteed revenue and all that kind of stuff. So this is essentially the nature of all this sort of stuff. And so when we look at like wireless and the power that it offers, it's just a clear incentive that we have to move and evolve our infrastructure to a more wireless one. And the couple last things I want to illustrate to you guys is at least give you a sense of like what this looks like, right? It's stuff that we have built in Andrena, but now that we bring towards retail and others, I think there's two major ways to think about it from the go-to-market side of stuff and what this wireless world looks like. The first one, which kind of alludes to my $128 Verizon bill, is you're going towards a world where people can be able to tap directly into data centers. If I can throw up my own antenna or have a router in my home that allows me to bypass these last mile guys and go directly to a data center, I could pay $1 for the same internet that I'm getting because it only costs them 50 cents. There's still margin to be had for everybody. But the point being is I just don't need to rely on the wires here to be able to go from point A to point B. And so again, if you can tap directly into wholesale, now consumers can actually take care of the arb. And that is really kind of where that second point comes in, is most people are buying more than they have the need for. So if you could actually allow consumers to be able to sell to their adjacent neighbors, now I can take my $128, I can sell to my neighbor for $10, $15, and I'm recouping the investment on my hardware in less than a year, right? Like that's the future that I think we're trying to build here. And so, the Airbnb model is kind of the one that I always use to there. And so before we get kind of, I guess, to the last piece here, the major thing is tying it back to what we discussed in the very beginning of the presentation, right? In this model, anyone can really participate. And so, again, we're just lowering the barrier to entry for people to participate in this wireless digital infrastructure. And that, of course, comes with its own challenges. So the major thing that I explain to somebody, if you think about it from a technical perspective, what are we really doing? And Dawn is answering a very simple question that, I was in Bell Labs a couple weeks ago, like talking with people that actually created the internet. And it's kind of crazy to me how people didn't really ask this question, but they didn't really have to. Even in a world where we had shared wires versus dedicated wires, the barrier to entry was still high enough that they didn't have to answer this question. But now that we go to a wireless one, we really are faced with this question, is how do you build a network with people who don't trust each other? Like a question that does not have an answer. And our choice is to take the existing TCP/IP stack, add some blockchain elements, and bring this to market. So that's the overall nature of this sort of stuff, and wireless really does force us to answer this question. And last thing I'll leave it to you guys before I guess we open it up to questions is if there's anything I want you guys to keep in your mind about what the hell is Neil talking about, what is Neil doing, the easiest mental model, which is what I tell my parents and what I tell people that don't really know technology and crypto, is I say, we're just trying to do to internet what solar panels have done to electricity, right? The same way that consumers can own their own infrastructure, get access to a very cheap and abundant resource, but then sell their surplus back to the grid, it ultimately manifests as connectivity independence. And that is kind of the major goal for all of this. And if you wonder why I'm always jacked up when I'm talking about this stuff, it's because I think it's a really big vision, right? And so I'm excited to be able to bring this one to you guys. Hopefully you guys found this little bit of a primer and the TCP/IP stuff interesting, but yeah, here we are. That's all I got for you guys.